Yep. Don't be bashful. Thank you for joining me this morning for what I believe is an important announcement. I see Representative Ladyman here. Thank you for joining us as well. And today I'm joined by Fred Weatherspoon, who is the Deputy Director of the Arkansas Law Enforcement Training Academy, who's from Pine Bluff, graduate of Southern Arkansas University. I'll say something more about him in a moment. Also, Jamie Cook, our Secretary of the Arkansas Department of Public Safety. We have Scott Hamilton here, who is the CEO and President of the Urban League of the state of Arkansas. Thank you, Scott, for being here. We have Rosa Velasquez of Arkansas United. Rosa, you're behind me. And then Jimmy Warren, who's a citizen advocate from Conway. Thank you, Jimmy. And then Tim Campbell, who is also with me, who has been one of the leaders of the protest movement. Probably others could be included in that category, but Tim, thank you for being here from Little Rock. I think we have Scott Bradley that will be, Sir Scott Bradley with the Arkansas Sheriff's Association. Thank you for being a part of this as well. And did I include everybody there? I think I got everybody. A recurring theme over the last few weeks, ever since the tragic and death of George Floyd, has been the need for improved law enforcement training, the need for increased racial understanding and accountability in law enforcement. And as everyone knows, I have a long history all through my public career with law enforcement. I identify with law enforcement. But the most critical element of law enforcement is trust. Trust with the community, trust with individuals, trust that you're acting with integrity within the law. And obviously with the death of George Floyd and being seen across the nation, that trust has been undermined. And I think we've all learned that we can do things better, we can relate to the community better, we can exercise racial tolerance and understanding much better. And so that recurring theme has been reinforced by my discussions with a number of the protest leaders here in Arkansas. And I visited with them. They come across and they are very genuine, they're very sincere, and they're very committed to change and see things improved in terms of the relationship between law enforcement and the community, and also to make sure that we have the right accountability for our officers, and particularly those that do wrong, and particularly those that exercise prejudice in their law enforcement activities. So today, as a result of these discussions and as a result of what we've seen across the nation in Arkansas, I'm signing an executive order today which creates the task force to advance the state of law enforcement in Arkansas. And I want to cover a little bit of the purposes of this task force. The members of the task force shall have the following duties: to review the adequacy of law enforcement training, policy, and operations specifically related to cultural, racial, and community relations. To study and analyze the processes for accountability, discipline, removal, and decertification of officers who do not meet the standards, including an evaluation for the creation and implementation of a statewide public database of complaints and resolutions concerning law enforcement officers. These are a couple of the matters that I think Jimmy and Mike will have identified as things that are needed to be reviewed and studied. It's also to review community policing and how that can be enhanced in Arkansas and more effective. To study the standards, requirements, and obstacles in recruitment, hiring, and retention of law enforcement officers, recognizing the important work that they do. make recommendations to the governor on enhancing the trust between law enforcement and the communities, and make recommendations to the governor on improvements or changes needed to enhance the profession of law enforcement to ensure compliance with standards. This task force will make a final report to me by December 31, 2020, and the work of the task force will be concluded upon submission of the report. Some of the attendees or members of the task force that are not here today, I'll just read a couple of them. Percy Wilburn, former chief of police in Lake Village. He's vice chairman of the Arkansas Commission on Law Enforcement Standards. Shirley Washington, the mayor of Pine Bluff, who I'll see a little bit later, will be on this task force. James Sanders, mayor of Blytheville. Tim Helder, sheriff of Washington County. Kendrell Collins, assistant federal public defender, will be on this task force. And the other will have representatives from different branches of law enforcement there. And there will also be additional citizens that I can name to this task force as we go forward. And I want to thank each of the attendees that are here for their agreement to participate in this important task force and the work that is ahead. I did want to also make one other comment about law enforcement. I do want to emphasize the support that I have for law enforcement, their dedication, their sacrifice, and the critical role that they have in public safety. I also want to be clear that there will not be an agenda item on defunding law enforcement through this task force. Now, it is always a fair discussion as to how funding is used and where the needs are, and that discussion is fair and can be a part of this. But I've talked to the members of the task force, and this is not to take away from law enforcement. This is to enhance law enforcement, to make them more better trained, to make sure that they have adequate discipline, that they have adequate accountability, as well as the other items that I've mentioned. I've asked Fred Weatherspoon to chair this committee, who has an incredible history. And before we turned over for questions, I want to invite him to come up and to make a comment on this important task force. And I might add, in talking with Secretary Cook, that our law enforcement standards in Arkansas were brought about over 45 years ago. And since that time, there has not been a comprehensive review of our standards, of our accountability, and how we can improve the current system of training and holding our officers accountable. And that's an important part of it. So with that, Fred.
Hello, everyone. This is an amazing opportunity for us in law enforcement to regain the trust of citizens throughout our communities. And this can be done through collaboration. And I think the collaboration starts today with this forming of this committee that has a very important task ahead of it. Remember this, no change occurs without open and honest communication, without embedded agendas or ideals designed to undermine as concepts are being discussed. So with that, that's going to be the basis and the premise for which we will do our work. We're going to try to reassure the public that law enforcement are here to serve them and to keep them safe. I also like to share a little history in reference to why I feel important to be a part of this here task force. And I must go back to when I was a 10-year-old child and relate an incident that occurred that had forever changed me in my attitude toward law enforcement and guided me on this path to where I am today. As a 10-year-old child, I also experienced the after effects of police brutality through my father's incident. My father was arrested some years ago in Jefferson County, and he was arrested, and then he was, during the process of this arrest, he was subject to excessive force by the officers at the time. To the point that when my mother and my uncle brought him home, that myself and my older brother, we ran from him because we didn't recognize him because of the severity of the beating he had received. So throughout my remaining years, I too had a different perspective about law enforcement and their true purpose. But as I matriculated through and attended college at Southern Arkansas University, and after graduation, I had an opportunity to go to work at the Magnolia Police Department, where I worked for nearly 10 years. But prior to then, a good friend of mine who was also working at the police department prior to my decision to go to work there, he asked me why would I be interested in becoming an officer for the city of Magnolia. At the time, I declined, and I explained the reason that I just shared with you. But after a few days of deliberating on this conversation, and he had said, Fred, that would be your opportunity to make a difference, to make a meaningful difference in law enforcement and how people view law enforcement in the future. And with that encouragement from him, I went, sat, and talked with the mayor at the time. And I accepted his offer to become a police officer with the city of Magnolia, Arkansas. And through that opportunity to become involved with the city and the community leaders, I feel like that we did make a difference in how police were received and accepted in the city of Magnolia, Arkansas. And after leaving the city of Magnolia to come to work as a training instructor at the Arkansas Law Enforcement Training Academy, that was another opportunity that allowed me and all the training instructors and administration at the time to also engage on an opportunity to improve that relationship through our training efforts. And through that training efforts, we have extensively, particularly under the leadership of Ms. Jamie Cook, we have consistently reviewed our training curriculum, and through my day-to-day oversight, I ensure that our training curriculum is carried out to the letter, that our training is done with integrity, and that the things that we stand on are constantly reinforced. So when students leave our training facilities, I am very confident that they are well-grounded in the right way of doing things. And that is going to be the purpose of this committee, is again to reinforce those things that they were trained on, and to reassure that they do not and will not diverge from those things in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. And just as a little background, the state's role in this is to certify through our Commission on Standards law enforcement officers, police officers all across the state. And Secretary Cook was telling me that I believe it was in 1996, there were 6 officers that were decertified because of violating the conduct that they should carry out as law enforcement officers. 6 of them in 1996. Last year, 40 were decertified. Now, this is not going to be a static task force. It's going to be dynamic. It's going to be listening to the community. It's going to be addressing the serious issues that we've seen reflected across the country. It's also going to reflect as to the needs of law enforcement as to how we can enhance their training, their accountability, as I've said. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes, ma'am. We're right here.
What kind of things were you taking into consideration when making your recommendations and picks for the people part of the task force?
That we wanted to have people who are involved in the protest, leading that discussion, which are mostly young people. We wanted them a part of this. So we wanted this task force to reflect the community. We also wanted to have a reflection of law enforcement so that they can communicate one to another. And that's a pretty good dynamic for change and for improvements and for finding the gaps. Just because we've been doing this since 1978 does not mean we're doing it right or we can't do it better. And so that's who's made up in this task force. I think it's a good balance. As we see gaps in the task force, I'll be able to add to it.
What do the current standards allow for in regards to chokeholds, and is that something this task force is going to be looking at, and do you support eliminating that as a tactic?
Fred, do you know the answer to that?
There is no
Well, why don't you come up with the microphone? Come with the microphone.
Currently, during our training at any of our training facilities, we do not implement training chokeholds.
Okay.
What are they specifically barred? Or is there training against the use of that?
We advise that the use of excessive force to include choking someone is not part of our training curriculum.
And thank you, Fred. And so there's not a law that prohibits it in Arkansas. It's not trained as an effective tool that's utilized in our law enforcement training academy. As to whether that should be further addressed in terms of any prohibitions or other constraints on that that individual departments might use, I think that it can be a topic of this task force.
Little Rock is doing an independent review of their entire workings. Would that be something that you would support from a statewide standpoint?
I did see what the mayor did in terms of the city of Little Rock, and I applaud him for that initiative. Obviously, this is looking at it from a statewide perspective, and we'll probably learn from each other through that process. So I'll have to look at more of the details as to what they have done and what their plans are. But this task force is designed to look at all police departments, at all certified law enforcement officers across the state.
Has there been any more pressure or thought into removing the Confederate statue here on Capitol grounds?
That is a matter for the legislature to address if they wish to do so, and I haven't heard any discussion that they're going to bring that up. Yes?
Do you consider forming this task force as overdue?
You know, whenever you look at the fact that we've never done this before, I would say yes. I think this is, you know, would have been nice probably to do this 5 years ago, but we didn't. And so this is something that we have seen in recent days as certainly needed, both in terms of a substantive review, but also in terms of a relationship with the community and to improve that communication.
How did the selection process work when forming this task force?
How did the selection process occur?
Yes.
Well, you know, it's my task force, so I get to make the selections on it. You know, I have met with a number of the protest leaders that we had a good dialogue and communication, but more broadly, as a result of the protest, I've had communication with a number of leaders in the community. Many of those are reflected in the task force behind us. Others are on the task force membership. And they were selected because they're representative of the community and of the protest and what is needed. Jimmy Warren here, whenever we met with him, he handed me a list of what he would like to see. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
He was very clear that he would like to see these things done, these steps taken. And Tim right here, when I met with him on the first time, he said, this is what needs to be done. And he said, in fact, I demand this to be done. Is that what you said?
Yes, sir.
That's what he said. And so, and I've seen him on TV, so I know he's a protest leader. But, you know, they were selected because not that we're in agreement on everything, but that they bring a reflection of the community to this discussion that I believe is important in combination with our law enforcement community.
How many times is this task force expected to meet before December?
Well, I would expect that they will meet within the next week. Need for meeting. This will be staffed by, staff will be available to them to help them in the process, but I'll leave it to the chairman as to how much they meet, but I'm sure that they'll be meeting very regularly between now and the time the report is needed. Yes, right here.
When was the time as far as when you started thinking about putting this together?
I started thinking about putting this together after I met the first time with some of the protest leaders, and I recognized that what they're asking for ought to be done, and that it's something that we can have common ground in pursuing. And just so that you'll understand that this whole area has not been neglected in my administration, I have already been working on sentencing reform and some other things that are also important to the community, in fairness in our sentencing and our use of incarceration. And that's something that is separately being examined, but this is a very important addition to it, to look at policing as a whole, certification, accountability, and training. One more. Was there? Yes.
Do you intend to use this task force to continue the conversation even after its report in December, or is this just for this year?
Well, let's wait and see what the report looks like and what the recommendations are. If they recommend continued oversight or continued study in a particular area, that's wide open. That to me is something that they should be looking at.
As far as the recommendations go, do you have any expectation for whether those will be things that can mostly be done via executive action, or will it also require legislative action?
I would expect that there will probably be a combination of those. Some of them will just be actions that the Commission on Law Enforcement Standards will be able to take. There'll be other issues that might be funding issues that, you know, one of the discussions might be body cameras. Well, body cameras take money if that's a decision that have to be made, and policy. And so I expect that there will be a wide-ranging set of recommendations that will involve funding issues, involve policy, and it could involve legislation. We'll just have to wait and see.
Do you think that law enforcement should better reflect, I guess, the racial makeup of those communities? I mean, obviously, your candidate pool is what it is at times, but is that something that can be done?
Well, I think that's part of community policing, that the police officers are part of the community and they know them. It's easier to do work and in a way of trust. And so I think that'll be part of the conversation. Let's see where that leads. All right, with that, thank you and everyone here is open to make any statements they want to make, but in the interest of shortness, I'll let you talk to them afterwards if you desire. Thank you very much. Okay.